Helpful. When I did this with the youth group, I said, if you imagine Star Wars and Star Trek, do you know those two things? If you put the characters of those two together and try and make sense of those movies, you're in big strife. When we look at baptism, there are two main windows that Christians look at baptism through. One is called a covenantal way, which replaces the circumcision in the Old Testament with baptism. And so that becomes a window that we understand baptism. So many churches, Catholics, Anglicans, Presbyterian Uniting Church and stuff like that, will baptise infants, and in part of that framework is to say it's like a way of setting aside our children, indicating that they are part of the family of God in the same way that the Old Testament or Jews baptised their children. And so that makes sense. And often those faiths, as does Judaism, will say there comes a time where those persons need to own that for themselves, and that's what we often call confirmation. So that's one framework to say, okay, we recognise that those children, we want to set them apart for God, and then at an appropriate time they own that for themselves. Now that makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? Okay, that's one window, and obviously a lot of churches look at it that way. If you look at what we're about to do today through that window, it'll get confusing, because you'd go, oh, well, hasn't this already been done? Baptists, probably a lot of Pentecostals, Church of Christ, and a number of other faith groups look at this through a different window, which is the window of the symbolism of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. And the first thing, we don't do adult baptism. That's the first mistake that people make. We do believers' baptism. And if the child is young enough to accept Christ, they're old enough to be baptised. So we wait until that. Some churches will do something, almost a substitute or a difference. They'll do an infant dedication. I like to call it a celebration of life service for babies. But baptism, we wait until the person themselves chooses. So it's believers' baptism, not adult baptism, because we'll baptise children if they're of an age where they can make a decision for Christ. And in Romans chapter 6, which is probably the window that we look at it through, Paul says, don't you know that when you were baptised into Christ, you were baptised into his death and his resurrection? And the baptism by immersion carries that image. So it's not that we just think that we need to use more water than other groups. It actually has meaning and symbolism. And so when we immerse someone, it's symbolic of being buried and risen with Christ. That's the image. So can you see how there are two different windows to look through that? So today we'll go down to Boambee Bay, and I'm going to, in a moment, I'm going to ask some questions of both Don and Marilyn that normally you would do at the baptism. I'll explain what they are. So the questions that I will always ask someone, is it your own decision to be baptised here today? That's a generic question. And because even though Baptists look through a different window, and Church of Christ and people like that, it's easy, particularly in the early teenage years, for people to either feel pressured from their family that, oh, isn't it time for you to be baptised? And we want to know that the person it's their own choice. It's not because of pressure or obligation or because their friends are all doing it. Now, those of you know, either Marilyn or Don, asking them, is it your own decision, is an automatic yes. They are not the personalities that can be easily pushed around, intimidated, or pressured into doing something they don't want to do. And so, but nevertheless, we say, is it your own decision? That's the believer's baptism thing. The next question is, have you accepted Jesus Christ as your personal Lord and Saviour? Because that's the statement of confession. And the third question is, do you intend to follow him all the days of your life in the fellowship of his church? And so that question says, not only are you being baptised into the name of Jesus, but that it's into his church, or it's a commitment to his church. Not this church, but Christ's church. In other words, it's a commitment to be part of God's people, which fits in well with today's sermon. So the first thing I need to make very clear, none of them are becoming Baptists today. They're not changing allegiance, they're not, that's not what it's about. In fact, you don't need to be baptised in this church to become a member or anything like that. So the first thing, let's get that out of our mind. They're not changing sides, or they're not even stepping up into a new, more exalted level of service. Because anyone that knows them knows that they're in boots and all. A few months ago, we witnessed the baptism that Pastor Mark Naden did down at Boambee Bay. He probably put it a little blunter than me. He's an Indigenous pastor. He said, nothing magical is going to happen here today, they're just going to get wet. I thought, yeah, well, Mark, I see where you're going. It's not magical, it doesn't elevate people, but I think it is significant. And part of that significance is as a step for both of these people, for all people of obedience.